Tax relief is coming to hundreds and thousands of Massachusetts families after Beacon Hill finally agreed to a new reform deal after more than a year of discussions, promises, and setbacks. The law includes a credit for families with children, seniors, or disabled adults, a boost in the earned income tax credit, and a whole lot more. If Governor Healey signs it into law, you'll see the difference in your taxes next season, when it's expected to cost the state $560 million. Joining me to break it all down are State House News Service reporter Chris Lisinski and Evan Horowitz, Executive Director of Tuft's Center for State Policy Analysis. Chris, Evan, thanks for being here. There's a lot to go through.
Absolutely.
So, Chris, I want to start with you. This has been, by one count I saw this morning from the Charles River Chamber of Commerce, 550 days in the making, which sounds just about right.
Yeah.
How did it take us so long to get to this point?
Well, of course, there's the usual slow pace of action on Beacon Hill that we've become so used to in recent years. But the real reason this took more than one legislative session was last year's surprise emergence of nearly $3 billion owed back to taxpayers under Chapter 62F, the tax cap law that requires revenues above a certain amount to go back in automatic relief. Top Democrats in the House and Senate were so blindsided and thrown off by that, they decided just to abandon the concept of tax relief altogether and circle back to it this time around when, conveniently, there was also a Democrat in the corner office.
As opposed to when it came from former Governor Charlie Baker last year. And now that we know that there is a bill, it's sitting on Governor Maura Healey's desk. Assuming she signs it, Evan, what kind of difference is this going to make for people when they are paying their taxes next year?
I mean, she's going to sign it. Because she supported most of the provisions in it. And it makes a difference. Some of these are significant and really impactful. You mentioned the child independent tax credit. You think of it first and foremost as a child sort of money for people with children.
Sure.
Money for children that goes to their parents. And you get that money regardless of what you owe in taxes. This is a really meaningful change in the way the state thinks about supporting parents and building off a very successful federal program that has since then. So that's the biggest part of this and by far the most impactful part. There's other stuff, as you mentioned, for people who rent, for seniors who are house rich and cash poor. But at least on the personal side, it really is the child tax credit that matters the most. On the business side, I'm happy to talk about that too. They got some stuff that I didn't expect to see and is there now.
Let's talk about that. What didn't you expect to see that made it in this final bill?
Well, I don't want to get too technical about a thing called the single sales factor, but
already too technical.
That's why I barely said it. But basically, there was a major change to the way businesses are going to pay taxes in this state, and this is a major change that was not in Healey's proposal, that was only in the proposal from one of the bodies, it was the House and not the Senate, and that there's been really very little groundwork for. There weren't like a bunch of studies, there weren't people pushing saying, oh, it would cost this much, it would have this much economic benefit. No, it was just lobbyists said, this would be good, we would really like this, and it ended up in the bill, and it's a very significant change in terms of the business competitiveness environment of the state.
Okay, and at the risk of staying too technical for, your Friday night, Chris, what about the changes we saw in this bill to a couple of voter-approved tax laws?
That's right. One of which is Chapter 62F, which is already on our radar because it's what threw off tax relief last year.
That's that rebate law, that revenue cap.
Tax cap rebate law. If it ever gets triggered again, which it won't. It's very unlikely, seems unlikely.
It's only been twice since the 1980s so far.
1987 and then last year. If it were to happen again, taxpayers would not get a rebate in proportion to what they owed. They'd get a flat rebate. So Bob Kraft and me would get the exact same amount of money back from the state of Massachusetts, other than, unlike last year when Bob Kraft got tens of thousands of dollars and I got several zeros less than that much.
Right, and then we have the change that kind of responds to the millionaire's tax that passed last year. Evan, can you run through
Well, this is
what
going to be part
did?
of an ongoing fight the state is going to have to fight with tax attorneys and tax prep people. Taxpayers looking for loopholes, finding loopholes, and the state saying, we don't really want you to drive through this loophole. We're going to close this. In this case, it was the ability of taxpayers to say to the federal government, yeah, we're a couple, we file jointly. And then to the state say, no, actually, we're separate and we're going to file separately. And if you do that, you can save some money on the millionaire's tax. And the state came in and said, nah, you're either a couple or you're not, and you have to file the same way in both. And it's a totally reasonable thing to do and probably will save the state a lot of money, a lot of lost money from that strategy.
Now, one of the criticisms I think we've heard emerge since in the past week as we've seen this bill become ready is the idea that, okay, we just passed a tax that generates $1 billion in new revenue, and here we are ultimately with a bill that, when it's fully implemented, will cost $1 billion. We'll give back $1 billion. Evan, what do you make of this? Is this...
I think that math is right, and I think it's a very strange thing for the state to have done, to have spent years working towards the passage of a millionaire's tax. Years. It was a failed ballot initiative, then a failed effort to get on the ballot, then a successful ballot initiative, advocacy from unions, from major groups, a lot of work. We passed this bill that is going to raise, as you say, $1 billion to $1.5 billion a year, and we turn around and within one session we've spent 2/3, 3/4 of the expected money. So regardless of whether you think the things we're doing in this tax package are valuable, I think some of them are really valuable, some of them less valuable, it really has undone the bulk of the revenue changes. That math is not made up, that criticism is not made up.
Is this something that the state can afford? I know the revenue picture has changed a little bit since we first started talking about this.
So I have significant concerns about the affordability of a package of this size. I think it's roughly twice as big as it should be, and it'll certainly be affordable for this year. Well, certainly is too strong. It's likely to be affordable for this year, but I think it puts us in a vulnerable position moving forward, and unnecessarily vulnerable position. That is, we didn't have to take this on, right? When we started talking about this, as you say, 500 and some odd days ago, we were in a very different place economically. The COVID recovery remained uncertain. People were still struggling with COVID-related after effects and shocks, and it was clear that there was a need for intervention. That's not the situation we're in right now. We're just getting over some inflation problems, overheated economy. So the need for economic support is totally different, and yet the package looks almost exactly the same. And I think that probably was a mistake, and this is too big. And would I be surprised if people were regretting this a few years down the road? No.
And just to speak to the
Yes.
state government aspect of it, this fiscal year alone, we're something like $100 million short in tax revenues that lawmakers are going to have to find a way to make that up. There's a possible amount owed to the federal government for unemployment benefits. Some $2.5 billion was paid out incorrectly, using the incorrect mechanism.
And we still haven't heard how that's going to be resolved after it surfaced a couple months ago.
No word whatsoever. So there are other cost drivers out there lingering that could suddenly make lawmakers regret not having this much revenue in their pocket.
So with all this out there, we saw this bill come down from a House and Senate negotiating team, from leadership at the beginning of this week, and it sailed through the legislature pretty much. What were lawmakers' reactions to this bill?
Yeah, that's right. It sailed through, only 2 votes in opposition, one from Progressive Rep. Mike Connolly of Cambridge, the other from Progressive Senator Jamie Eldridge of Marlborough. Lawmakers expressed, pardon the pun, a lot of relief that finally this is done after more than a year of their conversations, and no one really had many issues with it. We saw a little bit of hesitation from some Republicans about the 62F and millionaires filing changes that were packed into this, but that wasn't enough in their minds to sully the overall package itself, and it really sailed through with a lot of self-pats on the back from lawmakers.
And do you have a sense, Chris, I feel like we've seen a lot of headlines lately about the idea that, this impasse on the tax relief bill, the time it's taken to get an answer there is another indication of how the House and Senate really just don't get along. Is this a sign that that dynamic was either, not true to begin with or might be starting to ease?
I wouldn't assign too much value to the fact that they got a deal done on this. I mean, the pressure was enormous on lawmakers, both from Governor Healey and from residents who have been reading about this for so long that they just wanted some kind of an answer, some kind of action. Every other sign we're getting from legislative leaders suggests there is definitely a frosty relationship between the House and Senate, to put it nicely.
That was beautifully put. Beautifully. Yeah, I love that.
Wordsmith here. We've got House and Senate committee chairs who are still not meeting together, who are holding 2 separate hearings on the exact same legislation, requiring people to come in and testify twice simply because they cannot agree on the way to do their business. So I think all of the other indicators are that tensions are definitely still running high.
And Evan, I know there's talk about this already as a generational bill. That's what Senate President Karen Spilka was saying. What do you think the odds are we see any other tax policy moves from lawmakers in the near future? Is this it? Does it kind of clear the plate?
I think this clears the plate, but I wouldn't call it a generational move. But I guess, it definitely, as I say, it's going to help some families. There's no question about that. It's going to change the business landscape. But like a generational move is like we were the first state to pass the minimum wage in the country. Like that's a generational move. Romney Care is the basis for like that's a generational move. This is a tax package that matters, but let's be clear about the actual stakes. One thing I do want to say is that about the Frosty relationship. As far as compromises go, what this bill suggests is that they do know how to compromise, right? The way this came together is just classic compromise approaches. That is, the House did one thing, the Senate did another thing, so they got together and they either said, okay, let's do both, or let's cut the baby in half. And that's really how we ended up with this tax package. And so it suggests at least the mechanics of compromise are there. They know how to structure these conversations, even if they don't love to have joint meetings all the time. When they close the doors, when they're working through things, they know how to get to yes. And in this case, I think that's an important signal because they have not been getting to yes very frequently. So not only do they get to yes here, but they got to yes in a way that shows they know how to do it. They know how to talk through these conversations. They know what it takes for future bills. So I think that's hopeful, if you're looking for a hopeful sign.
And speaking of future bills, we've got maybe 6 weeks. We've got till mid-November until the legislature breaks for its next recess. What else, Chris, do you think is on the potential agenda for action this fall?
Yeah, we know that salary transparency bill that just popped recently seems to be on the House's agenda for the fall. This would make Massachusetts join a pretty small but growing list of states where employers are required to say up front when posting a job, here's the salary or wage range for it. We also know that Speaker Mariano still has his eye on a really wide-ranging gun reform bill that has drawn a ton of criticism, still saying that's on the fall agenda. On the Senate side, something to do with early education and care, something to do with prescription drug prices, which has not gone anywhere in the House in recent sessions. Beyond that, it's a bit of a question mark, and anything can kind of come up last minute and suddenly make it to the floor a day or two after emerging from committee.
Absolutely. There's always those fall surprises.
You do feel the clock kind of ticking, because the actual deadline, the end of session deadline, is now 7 months away, something like that. And they do try to do everything in the last 2, 3, 4 weeks. But those last 2, 3, 4 weeks are going to, I think, sneak up on people if they haven't done the prep work. So I'm looking forward to a very busy spring as we cover a lot of these things. But I think they're kind of moving headlong to what's going to be a really, really busy and maybe abortive kind of spring where they fail to accomplish the things that they are expecting to accomplish at the last minute.
And I thought you were leaving us on a hopeful note.
I could do that if you want me to go back to my previous point, but I think, I'm not feeling good about their ability to reach compromise on complicated issues at the last minute as they are wont to do.
Okay, well, I guess that's something to watch for as we head through the fall and on into the spring and summer and keep watching the legislature. Evan Horowitz, Chris Lisinski, thanks so much for being here and for talking about this all, and there's so much of it, with us tonight. That is it for tonight. We'll be back next week.